my pleasure to introduce Michael Clemens and Mariapia Mendola, who are with us today for our online seminar on the economics of migration. As I said, I don't think that I need to spend much time to present either of the two presenters today. So it's really our pleasure to have both of you with us online today. And Michael, the floor is yours for 45 minutes.
Thank you so much. I had to start just by thanking those of you who created this seminar. It's such a massive service to the field, to the profession. I learned from Simone that some of the people most responsible are Jesus Fernandez Huertas, Frederick Dokier, Michel Bend, Simone himself, Giovanni Perianchala, Özden. Perhaps there are others. Thank you, all of you, for doing this and for the invitation. As Simone said, this is joint work with Mariapia Mendola, who is also online. And I'll start with these people. This is a group of people in Honduras preparing to emigrate from Honduras in January of this year. And there have been quite different strands of literature asking important questions about people like these emigrating from developing countries. One in the labor literature, asking the degree to which they are self-selected on the overall determinants of income, on the observable determinants of income, on the unobservable determinants of income. And our textbooks prominently feature models about how that selection would go. We have limited evidence simply because it is inherently difficult to study. In most settings, it requires detailed information on the immigrants prior to departure. And that's simply not available most of the time. Separately, in the development literature, the question has often been asked, what will happen to the propensity of these people to emigrate from Honduras and other developing countries as Hondurans get richer, as Honduras gets richer? What is the income elasticity of emigration? And what we're going to argue in this paper is that under pretty mild assumptions, these are actually two forms of the same question, the question of the degree of self-selection on income and the income elasticity of immigration, so that with data about one, we can learn something important about the other. And we're going to bring new data to measure this, what we argue is a unified relationship from nationally representative survey data from 99 different developing countries. So I'll start just by explaining what I mean when these are under mild assumptions, two forms of the same question. If we think about a distribution of income in a developing country, if immigrants are typically coming from low in that distribution, we're observing a negative selection. If they're coming from high in the distribution, we're observing positive selection. And if I just superimpose on this distribution of income a profile of the probability of immigration across the income distribution, clearly positive selection is implied by a rising profile. Rising profile is a sufficient condition for positive selection. People higher in the distribution are more likely to emigrate. Now, this positive selection, as determined by such a probability profile of immigration, has another implication. And it's that, what if we make everybody richer simply by shifting the entire distribution of income to the right? Well, the distributional mass at high probability of migration has risen. The distributional mass at low probability of migration has fallen. So the overall probability of migration is going to go up. There is positive income elasticity of migration generally. You can see that in this simple picture, it's visually obvious that the sign on the degree of self-selection on overall determinants of income and the income elasticity of migration have to be the same. Now, in the paper, we formalize exactly what looking like this picture means. The jointly sufficient conditions for looking like this picture are that the distribution of income is strongly unimodal and that the probability profile of immigration with respect to income is strictly monotonic. If you have both of those conditions, these selection and income elasticity have the same sign. Likewise, if the probability profile of migration is strictly decreasing with income, negative selection, there's going to be a negative income elasticity of immigration under those two jointly sufficient conditions. So a lot depends on the degree to which the real world looks like this picture. Now, the strong unimodality of the income distribution is an accurate first-order description of income distributions, which anyone knows who has worked with lots of survey data from developing countries. I won't talk too much about that, but I'll argue that we don't know much about, in general, across the developing world, about the shape of that blue line. Is it strictly monotonic? Is it upward sloping or downward sloping? For whom is it upward sloping? For whom is it downward sloping? And I want to take just a minute to talk about what we should expect that to look like. in the context of perhaps the simplest but still informative model one could use for such a purpose. And that is, to me, Gordon Hansen's formalization of the Roy model, in which a worker is making a location choice between the home country 0 and a foreign country 1. They have a min-Sarian wage in the home country determined by a fixed country component mu, a country-specific return to observed skill S and unobserved skill S tilde. There is also a min-Sarian wage for the same person abroad in country 1, and the gain to migration is modeled as simply the difference between these two wages. Now, if I take the derivative of that gain to migration with respect to the home country wage, W0, that derivative is positive up to a critical value W star and negative thereafter. That is the relationship between the gain to migration and implicit in this model, the probability of migration exhibits an inverse U relationship with the home country wage. Now notice there are no migration costs yet. There are no capital constraints yet. That inverse U relationship, that rising probability of migration implicit directly in the model, the rising gain to migration with income for the poorest people arises just because even though rising income and the rising determinants of income make people richer at home, when they're making the location choice, they're taking account of the returns to those characteristics abroad, which could be even higher. And it's at W star that the home country takes over, and the simple intuition of, well, more income at the origin has to dissuade this location choice sets in. A fortiori, if we add in migration costs, suppose that there's a fixed cost C and other costs that vary with skill, observed or unobserved. If we model as capital constraints as a negative theta in this equation, as a cost of migration that decreases with skill, and that's how Gordon does it, then that's going to raise W star even further. And you could get substantial parts of the population across whom increasing income is associated with a greater probability of migration via a higher gain to migration.
Michael, just a quick clarifying question. So in the blue line that you were showing later, which essentially speaks to these deltas, is it always fixed, or could it change as the whole economy develops?
That is a great question, and that maybe this is the last third or 40% of the presentation. So I'll ask you to hold off on that, but not in a perfunctory way. It's an absolutely central, critical point that I want to discuss later, if you don't mind.
Sure, no problem.
So staying with this extremely simple parsimonious toy model, here I'm just graphing the Hansen formalization of the Roy model for parameter values mu and delta that very roughly approximate the real United States and Honduras. United States, of course, in green, Honduras in red, with years of schooling on the horizontal axis, weight on the vertical axis. The gain to migration, the difference between those curves is here. And you can see rising with this roughly realistic parameterization up to 13.5 years of schooling. That is rising across almost the entire Honduran population. Again, with no migration costs. It's not rising much, but if there were a fixed migration cost, C in the model you saw earlier, it could rise proportionally quite a lot, maybe doubling across the distribution of schooling here. Now notice the absolutely central assumption of modeling the relationship between the probability of migration and these min-Sarian wages is that it's a function of the linear difference of wages in Gordon's formalization. You could also model that gain as a log gain and the fixed cost as a fixed percentage cost of the foreign wage. And that would look like this, and the gain to migration, the difference between the now dashed green line and the red line could be downward sloping across the entire distribution, strong negative selection. And what Gordon argues to me very persuasively, argued 10 years ago and has argued since, is that prediction is strongly refuted by the data from the context in which this model was developed, and that is migration to the United States. On the horizontal axis here, average years of schooling in home countries. On the vertical axis, average years of schooling in people born in those countries in the American Community Survey. There is only one country that isn't above the 45-degree line here. Very strong positive selection on schooling, suggesting that the model of proportional differences and proportional cost, in which the absolute cost of migration is actually rising in skill, he considers it as refuted, and to me that's persuasive. It brings to mind a comment that Alan Krueger made near the end of his life. The idea of turning economics into a true empirical science where core theories can be rejected is a big revolutionary idea. He certainly lived by that. And I interpret part of Gordon's research program, again, which I find very persuasive, as being that even though some of these core theories of selection that go in the other direction have been at the core of the discipline for quite some time, they are so strongly refuted by the data that we should think about the implications of alternative models. So going back to Gordon's linear difference model, notice I've included the fixed cost of migration here, C, but I'm still assuming that theta and theta tilde are 0. If there were also to be a capital constraint, again, modeled by Gordon as a cost that decreases in skill, then the difference could look like this. And we could plausibly get quite large rises in the gain to migration and perhaps the probability of migration across the distribution of major determinants of income. All of this just to think through what our priors might be about what this should look like. As I mentioned, it's very difficult to get data on migrants before migration. Our approach is to use the Gallup World Poll. So we use 6 rounds of the Gallup World Poll, 2010 to 2015 inclusive, comprising 653,613 individual respondents, nationally representative data on 99 developing countries. And in addition to the standard Minserian questions of earnings, education, et cetera, they're asked 3 nested questions about emigration. The first that we call the desire question, and this has been often used in the literature. Ideally, if you had the opportunity, would you like to move permanently to another country, or would you prefer to living in this country? If you say yes, they ask which one. If and only if you say yes, they get the plan question. Are you planning to move permanently to another country in the next 12 months or not? If and only if they say yes, they get the prepare question. Have you done any preparation for this move? For example, apply for residency or visa, purchase the ticket, etc. Of the people who desire, 1 in 7 are planning. Of the people who plan, 1 in 3 are preparing. So only 1 in 21 people make it from desire to prepare. For that reason, we argue that prepare contains quite a lot of information that the more frequently used desire question does not contain. And you end up with 7,013 people who state that they are preparing to move and have taken costly actions to get ready to move, with a mean of 71 per country. So before interpreting those data, I just want to show you what those data look like. This is across the distribution of household income per adult at purchasing power parity. This is on the left-hand axis, and in orange, the density of income on a log scale, looking Bell and strictly unimodal as you'd expect. On the right vertical axis and the blue line, and this is just a Nadaraya-Watson regression of the probability of a dummy for are you preparing to migrate or not. And you can see rising across most of the income distribution, perhaps falling, although not statistically significantly, at the top. Here's Nigeria. Certainly a strongly unimodal income distribution. To first approximation, a monotonically increasing probability of preparing to emigrate with income. Bangladesh, looking similarly. If we pool together everybody in the low-income countries, these are low-income countries as defined by the World Bank. There are 24 of them among the 99 countries for which these data exist. Pooling them all together, this is 125,000 individual respondents in one distribution and one Nadaraya-Watson regression. You can see that the considered as a whole in developing countries, we really do have strong unimodality of the income distribution and strictly monotonically increasing probability of saying, yes, I'm preparing to emigrate. All of the data have been demeaned by national income at 0 here. Moving to lower middle income countries as defined by the World Bank, including Honduras, a similar pattern. Moving now to upper middle income countries as defined by the World Bank. A similar pattern, perhaps more strongly rise with incomes. These patterns are generally are a stylized fact about the developing world in the data we have. So to me, the central empirical question of the paper is, to what degree can we interpret these facts about people's responses to a survey question as informative about migration? And this is a question that Simone has worked on. There's a remarkable paper by Jasper Tjaden and co-authors actually testing the relationship between people's answers to the question effectively of are you preparing to migrate on a bilateral basis from a country of origin to a specific country of destination versus actual migration flows from the country of origin to the country of destination, and they tend to find an elasticity of about 0.8. So prima facie, we would expect these survey responses to contain quite a lot of information about actual unobserved migration. That's external to the paper. In the paper, we conduct what I think is an informative test, which is that we exploit the nested nature of these migration questions. People are asked if they desire, if and only if yes, they're asked if they're preparing, and that is the variable we use. Of course, migration itself is not observed, but we can test the relationship between income and attrition in this pathway. How many, is it the case that richer people are more or less likely to make it from desire to plan, from plan to prepare? And what can we learn about the propensity to make it from prepare to migrate? In fact, as you might expect intuitively, the propensity of people to make it from an abstract desire to planning to migrate is the gap between a desire and plan is very strongly negatively associated with income. That is, the ability of people to realize their desire into a plan to emigrate is strongly positively associated with income. The gap between planning and actually preparing is negatively associated with income. That is, the ability of people to turn their plans into active, costly preparations is positively associated with income. We think that that's informative about the final step. It would be quite odd to me if richer and richer people were much better able to turn their desires into plans, their plans into costly preparations, but much less able to turn all of that investment into actual migration. The most direct evidence, of course, comes from the work of Simone and Jasper Tjaden et al.
Michael,
please, yes.
This is Michel. So please. I have just a small question with respect to the beginning of your talk. You were insisting on the fact that you are going to look at self-selection factors. But if we look at the difference between the desires and the plan and the desires and the preparation, to what extent is there not a role for out selection factors? For instance, immigration policy. So if I want to move out of my country, but I know that I have almost zero chance of getting the visa to my preferred destination, maybe I'm not going to plan anything for the moment, so within the 12 months window, and I'm not going to make any preparation. So can you say something about that?
I think it's absolutely correct. So I'm using self-selection in the sense that it's used in the literature or in Borjas's graduate textbook, et cetera, in that it's not strictly a measure of demand for migration, but it's a measure of the realization of migration. You're making an absolutely correct point that you could consider self-selection to be just the relationship between income and the demand for migration, regardless of supply constraints. If we were to consider it in the maybe more accurate sense in which you are using it, then absolutely there could be many things, both constraints of getting a visa, constraints of money to pay smugglers, constraints of other forms that could interfere between desire and plan and prepare and migration. And to me, and this was something that Hillel correctly pointed out at the Migration and Development Conference, to me, that means we should interpret all of the relationships that I'm about to show you as lower bounds on the degree of self-selection by income. That is, well, I'll show you a lot of point estimates, but if in fact there is a great deal of selection going on at each step of this attrition, it means that whatever point estimates we get from such an exercise, if we're to consider them as informative about unobserved actual migration, the degree of positive selection, and I will argue the degree of positive income elasticity of migration should be somewhere further from zero than those estimates.
So, Michael, can I follow up on that? I thought Michel was going to ask us. I mean, in this, I guess, regression, you're not controlling for the age of the respondent. That has high correlation with the desire to migrate. We know it drops drastically after, say, age 25, 28, and as well as it correlates with income, right? Mm-hmm. Because of the Mincer relationship. So how would that confound this relationship? Or one option.
We don't want to control for income.
But you want to control for age. But you want to control for age.
Could be very interesting to explore how this is heterogeneous by age, and we haven't. In fact, there's already so many tables and figures in the paper. We didn't we didn't do that. Also, there's a limitation of sample size, which is, as I mentioned, the average sample of people preparing is 71 per country. It's not as bad as it is in single rounds because we're pooling together 6 rounds. It could be even better if we pooled even more rounds. But there's not a lot of subgrouping we can do, but we could certainly test, older versus younger. Be quite possible and very interesting.
Okay.
At all steps of this attrition process, you're sparking a lot of interesting ideas about how the attrition could be different at different steps of the process according to individual characteristics.
Yeah.
So very good points. Thank you. If it is the case that we can learn something about unobserved migration behavior from the answers to these questions, we can do very simple things like simply regress log income, and this is household income per adult, because that's what the survey did allow, on a dummy for preparation. And by including or not including age, education, and gender dummies, these are dummies for ranges, so not much of a functional form assumption here. We can separate out that selection parameter into selection on observables and unobservables. And these are the results you get for low-income countries. People preparing to emigrate overall for the 24 low-income countries in the sample with 0.26 log points higher income overall than people who are not. And that is roughly evenly distributed between positive selection on observables and positive selection on unobservables to a slightly lesser degree. Generally similar parameter values for lower middle income countries or upper middle income countries. These patterns also seem to be a general stylized fact for the developing world as a whole, as represented by these 99 countries. We can do it separately by country. And the confidence intervals are large here because, again, an average of 71 people per country. But notice that each one of these is a completely independent exercise, and in 93 of the 99 countries, selection on overall determinants of income is positive. If we separately graph the individual coefficients you get for selection on unobserved determinants of income, the observed ones are in green, and that's how these are ranked. They're juxtaposed with selection on unobservables in red. You can see that, let's see, selection on observables is positive in 95 out of the 99 cases. Selection on unobservables is positive in 83 out of the 99 cases. There are 17 interesting countries where the sign on selection on observables is different from the sign on the selection on unobservables. And that supports a conjecture by Borjas 30 years ago, pointing out that there is no theoretical reason to think that that selection on observables, which is relatively easy to measure, need have the same magnitude or even sign as selection on overall determinants of income or selection on unobserved determinants of income, which of course are much harder to measure. Because migration to rich country destinations is of frequent policy interest, it's easy in these data to separate out the people whose answer to the original desire question, on which the rest of the nested questions are contingent, is a high income country as defined by the World Bank. And you might intuitively expect selection to be more positive for high income countries for the same reason that Mexicans in Australia are much richer than Mexicans in the United States. It's simply, it's a lot harder for a Nigerian to get to France than it is to Nigeria, and a lot of the cost parameters we could think of would be much higher and would raise that W star quite a lot. In fact, that is what we find. The coefficient on prepare in a regression of income on prepare, when prepare means only are you preparing to migrate to a high income country or not, is about double the magnitude of the coefficient that you saw in the earlier table, representing all migration to all destinations. And again, roughly equally determined by positive selection on observables and positive selection on unobservables, with notably the difference between these estimates and the previous estimates you saw for all immigration diminishes as we move to lower middle income countries and upper middle income countries, understandably, because for example, people from Malaysia, when they emigrate, are less likely to be going to low-income countries than they are to be going to high-income countries. So really, the emigration to all destinations and emigration to rich country destinations are more and more similar for upper middle-income countries than they are for low-income countries. Now, I'll just graph those out because, again, we can do it separately for each country. Here are the coefficients on prepare for each of the 99 countries individually when the migration is to rich country destinations only. I'll flip back to all destinations. I'll flip back to rich destinations. I'll flip back to all destinations. I'll flip back to rich destinations. And you can see across the board more positive selection to rich destinations. It's going to be quite difficult to see on your screens, and I don't have a good way to make a pointer, but one interesting thing to me is that if you look at all destinations. Fifth from the right in this graph, you will find Afghanistan with negative selection to all destinations, which of course includes Pakistan. Going to rich destinations, Afghanistan is now in the middle of this graph with a coefficient of about 0.5, a strong positive selection of Afghanis going to Europe, the United States, Australia, etc. And that to me accords very well with the model and with simple intuition. I want to move on to income elasticity because I made this strong claim at the beginning that this information about self-selection is informative also about income elasticity. We do a simulation exercise in the paper where we just do in the matrix of data exactly the visual exercise that I did at the beginning of this talk of moving the entire income distribution to the right across the same probability profile of migration and seeing what happens to overall migration. We divide the income distribution into ventiles, calculate the probability of immigration within each ventile, move the income distribution a certain amount. We also play with increasing or reducing the Gini coefficient to see how that changes it. But the most important result is that for low-income countries, if this very simple and mechanistic model were true, the income elasticity of immigration for just shifting the entire income distribution as is to the right comes out to positive 0.35. Now, you can imagine many reasons why that might not reflect, and now we're getting back to the first thoughtful question that we heard. We're getting back to the question of how, to what degree these micro data are informative about the relationship between national level development and migration behavior. There are all kinds of reasons we could think of why they would not be, some within the model. For example, Katja Batista, Olivier Sterck, David McKenzie have been studying the relationship between uncertainty of earnings abroad and migration. The model includes no uncertainty at all. Could be completely outside the model. It could be that, in fact, people's migration decisions are contingent on relative income in some way that is not captured by the explicit focus of this model on absolute income, or several other reasons. So it's interesting to step back and take a look at the same question from a completely different perspective. And here I'll just step out of this paper for a minute because I'll show you a couple of results from a different paper, which is just by me. Mariapia is not implicated in any failings of that paper, but it's called the Emigration Life Cycle. And in that paper, I just take a macro approach to a similar question using cross-country data, building on the work of Dao, Dauquier, Parsons, and Perry in the Journal of Development Economics. What can we learn about the income elasticity of migration from census data on migration that have been put together in a monumental effort by many of the people listening right now, and development over time. So if you just pool together the country level data on income per capita and the fraction in the global bilateral migration database, a fraction of people born in each country who live in another country, pool them together, pooled in cross-section and time series, and do a local linear regression, this is the relationship that you get. If you were to do a simple linear regression up to an arbitrary cutoff of $10,000, roughly the level of the Philippines or Tunisia right now, you'd get a very strong positive coefficient in the pooled data. It's been argued in parts of the literature that this is only representative of tiny little island countries or of south-south migration. This is what the same pooled relationship looks like if you drop the smallest quartile of countries, as Dao et al. Do in some of their work, and restrict the immigration counts to people living in high-income countries, as defined by the World Bank. The absolute rise from the poorest countries up to $10,000 is now about 5 percentage points instead of 6 percentage points, still very similar. The relative rise, the elasticity has gone way up. Instead of tripling, it goes up by an order of magnitude now. So really this pattern in the pooled data is certainly not a product of looking at small island states or just south-south migration. If you were to do the linear regression that you saw in those graphs up to $10,000, so that it's simple and transparent to just add fixed effects, for all migration and all countries of origin, the coefficient with fixed effects included is actually very similar and statistically indistinguishable from the pooled coefficient. So that those regressions on pooled data combining variance in cross-section and variance in time series is actually quite accurately representative of the paths that individual countries follow over time. And again, the elasticity is much higher, both cases, when you restrict to relatively large countries of origin and to south-north migration. That's in the first column there. That's stocks of immigrants versus levels of GDP per capita. In rough terms, in the second column, that's net flows of migration versus growth of income per capita. And I say in rough terms because, of course, the net change in stock is migration, but it's also deaths of people abroad. In an appendix to the paper, I do a robustness check with some data by Guiadal, who has estimated the same data using demographic corrections for deaths, and you get the same results. So that's why I say in rough terms, this is flows on growth in the second column. As countries get richer, there's a positive elasticity of the immigration location choice and the overall income of the country that turns out to be 0.35. And that's the fact that those two numbers are identical to two decimal places, the number that we get for low-income countries from our exclusively microdata-based simulation and this fixed effects regression across 60 years in the developing world at the country level is purely coincidence. As you can see, the confidence interval on the estimate is broad. I wouldn't make anything of the fact that they're both exactly 0.35, but to me, this is important corroborating evidence suggesting that these micro-level survey questions do contain some information about the relationship between development at the country level and people's behavior. I want to conclude just by talking about what I think is an interesting aspect of the paper, and I think Mariapia would agree with this. And it's we discuss in the paper why for poor people and poor countries this positive relationship between income and immigration is counterintuitive. I think within the profession, it has a lot to do with the fact that these absolutely fundamental core models that were original seminal contributions in the area have shaped our thinking about this for quite some time, and a lot of us learned them in textbooks. Gordon Hansen has argued that it's time to move on from some of those, and I really agree. Among the public, and also maybe for many economists, especially development economists, I think some of it is shaped by living in developing countries, by talking to people, by knowing people who will tell you to your face that if they personally had more economic opportunity at home, they would be less likely to move. That the simplest imaginable location choice model applies to them, in which case this result would be counterintuitive. And I just want to point out that those aspects of lived experience are fully compatible with the patterns that we see in these data, and it actually represents an instance of Simpson's paradox. It's not that people saying those things are wrong and this data is right. They are both correct in different senses. And to illustrate it, I'm just going to pool together all 653,000 people in a single Nadaraya-Watson regression, which is what you're looking at here. This is absolute income per capita, not demeaned at the country level now. And the probability of answering, yes, I'm preparing to emigrate. And you see the immigration life cycle coming out clearly and very strongly statistically significantly in the data. If all I do, and this is an exercise that's quite similar to something that in macro data, Dowd, Parsons, and Petty do in the JDE, if all I do is separate these data by education level, so this is secondary attained in green, secondary not attained in red, you can see that a lot of the immigration life cycle goes away. The propensity to be preparing to immigrate either doesn't rise much or actually falls with income within each of these groups. But of course, the composition of the groups is radically changing across the distribution of income, and that is the right-hand vertical axis. The dashed white line is the fraction of people answering the Gallup World Poll who do have secondary attainment. Development is not just a movement along these curves, it is a movement, it is a shift of people between the curves. And it can simultaneously be true, and this is a textbook example of Simpson's paradox, that the correlation in aggregate can be quite different from, or even the opposite sign of, the correlation within any subgroup, and even within every single individual. Even if the counterfactual income for for all individuals in all of the populations would have led them, a higher counterfactual income at home would have led them to be less likely to immigrate, it can nevertheless be true that among relatively poor people in the aggregate population, higher income is associated with higher propensity to immigrate, exactly for the reasons that we've known for 70 years through Simpson's paradox. Both of the underlying studies, the one that I'm actually presenting and the other macro one that I mentioned, are available here, and I would love to talk about them more with all of you. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Thanks a lot, Michael, for your great presentation. So I already have a few people that have asked to ask you questions. So Andreas is the first one.
Okay, yes, thanks a lot for this fascinating presentation. The question I have is whether your measure of household income actually includes or excludes remittances. So, I mean, it goes a little bit in the direction that of Michel's question. I mean, if it includes remittances, it might reflect already kind of some stronger attachment to a country abroad or the option to migrate, and this might drive part of the results. So, yeah, how did you specify that?
Thank you. So your Simone is nodding either internally or externally because he raised this point and we had a very interesting discussion about it. I think it is so. I'm trying to think of a way to briefly discuss this question without boring everybody else. It is a fantastic question. It would be very interesting to know what the relationship between income and immigration, controlling for remittance receipts, controlling for diaspora size might be. However, if we take diaspora size to be in part a product of past development, such as, of course, in the prototypical case of Mexico, the size of the diaspora of Mexico in the US that could send remittances home or otherwise facilitate the immigration of people from Mexico rose. It rose with the development of Mexico, and I would argue that it rose as a consequence of the development of Mexico. So there is a sense in which we would risk over-controlling by controlling for diaspora size, which is in fact one of the outcomes of economic development in this case. That doesn't mean that the parameter estimate is not useful, is not informative, should not be estimated. But I would argue that that we have to be cautious about what we control for if what we want to know is the generalized relationship between economic development and immigration. We wouldn't want to control for any part of the mechanism through which economic development causes or facilitates immigration. And if we think about diaspora size or anything correlated with diaspora size, like remittance receipts, we just need to be wary of that. Again, this is about interpreting the coefficients. Suppose we were to control for diaspora size, which we didn't do, and I think, Mariapia, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think actually in the raw data there is a question about do you have somebody in another country you can depend on to help you, which we didn't explore. But suppose we were to control for that and find that the sign reverses. We might be learning something about the fact that richer and richer people in Nigeria are more likely to have a friend abroad who can help them. But is that a cause of their higher migration behavior, or is that an effect of the fact that they are richer? It wouldn't be obvious to me. So I wouldn't be confident about what I am estimating, if that makes any sense. It's for that reason that I thought it best to start with the reduced form relationship and estimate the reduced form relationship. But once we start controlling for a variety of things, there's some epidemiologists call it the table 2 fallacy, that the coefficient estimates start to be more and more difficult to interpret. And I didn't come to any resolution with this when we talked with Simone. It could be that there is a very interesting interpretation of that coefficient that both of you could teach me, and I'm very willing to learn that. But I'm not advanced enough in my thinking to know how to interpret it right now.
Measure includes remittances.
Oh, the income measure. It's just overall income, and in the whirlpool data, there's no breakdown of income like you would find in a family income and expenditure survey. So, but I think that the best that could be done in the data, and we didn't even look at this, is this question about do you have a friend or family abroad who you can count on, or some wording like that.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Gaurav?
Hey, Michael, again, as always, a fascinating presentation.
Thank you.
I had a quick question. I think the gap between the desire and preparedness, like if we think of that maybe, as a measure of the costs and constraints of migrating, I wonder if we can take it more closely to the kind of the Gordon-Hanson version of the ROI model that you kind of showed, where on the horizontal axis you have years of schooling. And so I guess what I'm suggesting is running that same regression you ran, but with the right-hand side being schooling instead of income, because I think what that might help is also firstly address, Chala's point on the age being, so, the age determining both maybe your desire independent of income, but also, your age then determining your income trajectory, so if you instead use just something like your education levels, I think that in some ways makes it more directly related to what the kind of the Hansen graph was showing. But also with income, it's a little hard to map it to that graph, only because if you have your local income, but your origin level income, but what also matters is that gap between the origin income and the destination income, and that might not necessarily be constant across years of education, right? So I wonder if you thought it was interesting to try to do that same kind of regression with the education in some ways.
Thank you. That's a brilliant idea, and we didn't. In principle, I mean, you could do this. You could do the entire paper measuring selection at each of those steps overall by observables and unobservables, and you could do it for any set of observables. You could do it for age, for education, and I can see 33% of what we could learn from that, and I'll ask you later to fill in the other 66%. But I think it's a brilliant idea. And it's a concrete approach to that question. So thank you.
Michael, I would also like to ask a simple question. So I was looking at your appendix table 2, where you have all the numbers by country, and eyeballing the table suggests that you have more people preparing to migrate in countries that have large migrant stocks already. So my question is, do you perceive the data that you have as representing the entire population? Or how would the fact that a portion of the population has already moved out, especially where you have a lot of preparation, would enter into your story?
That's very interesting. So yes, it's wow, that's very interesting. So yes, you could imagine a hypothetical. So suppose we had access to an adjustment on the individual level between preparation and observed migration behavior. Like, a hypothetical data set where there was actual migration for each person. You're making the very interesting point that in that case, if what we really wanted to do was estimate a location choice model, we would need to include all the people who are currently choosing to live abroad and estimate, again, with a hypothetical data set, their counterfactual income when they had been in the country. And I guess we're implicitly assuming that the marginal people being interviewed to prepare right now are representative of those people who went before, and that may or may not be true. That's a strong assumption. I think in many cases it's a defensible assumption. And what's notable to me is the very the very large rise in this blue profile of preparation probability by income. I mean, suppose we were to find that the propensity among those who went before was only half, it would still be the case that you would expect to observe a positive selection to a lesser magnitude across the distribution. And a useful exercise that we haven't even considered, and it's a really brilliant suggestion, would be to do a little simulation of how different from prior migrants they would need to be to reverse the conclusion. And you can see that my prior is quite a lot, but that doesn't mean they aren't. So it could be quite a useful exercise. As I talk through it, is this this addresses what you're getting at?
Yes.
Well, thank you. It's a very, very interesting suggestion.
Well, actually, it was your suggestion, but it was fully in line with what I had in mind. So
it was underlying it. It was the origin.
And I have a second question. So I do believe that a question about preparation can be interpreted as concerning both legal migration or undocumented migration. But the question that I had in mind is related to some evidence that we have, for instance, with respect to Mexico, Hamilton and Saviner 2015, where people misreport. They don't want to tell that a former member of their household has moved out illegally. So imagine that you have already contacted a smuggler. Would you answer yes and preparing to move? And so if in a sense the distribution between legal and illegal channels systematically varies with income, that would imply a differential propensity to tell you the truth.
Thank you. So this question of the relationship with irregular migration is not just very academically interesting, it's obviously very highly policy relevant, which is why every time we mention this paper, people have asked about it. The only direct empirical approach we have, and it's unsatisfying because it's just based on observed characteristics, is that in the paper we compare the degree of selection on observable education level, secondary or tertiary attainment in the samples we have of these countries with actual recent arrivals in the US or Europe in corridors where clearly a large fraction of the flow is irregular. Hondurans in the United States, Nigerians in the EU, and at the level of selection on education only, there is no systematic difference between the degree of selection in the Gallup World Poll preparation data and the degree of selection for actual migrants who arrived in the previous 5 years in the DIOC data or in the current population survey of the US. Some examples of that are like the actual migrants are more likely to have completed secondary than the Gallup World Poll preparers in the United States from Mexico and Haiti. They are less likely to have completed secondary from Guatemala and Honduras. In the DIOC data in Europe, migrants from Afghanistan and Sudan are more likely to attain secondary than the ones in the Gallup World Poll data. They are less likely from Cameroon and Senegal. They are almost exactly as likely from Iraq, Mali, and Niger. That is not at all a definitive answer to the question because, of course, it sets aside the whole raison d'etre of this paper, which is to address selection on unobservables and therefore selection on the overall determinants of income. And that, because of sampling reasons you mentioned or other reasons, could be different for regular and irregular migrants. So I don't think the paper allows any definitive statement about irregular migrants specifically. Certainly, there are theoretical reasons even in the simplest location choice model that the relationship could be quite different for regular and irregular because, of course, the costs and the returns to education, et cetera, will be quite different. So I think that's a very useful avenue for further exploration. You mentioned that the just prima facie, the survey question does not distinguish between regular and irregular migration. It, as you saw on the screen, it mentions purchasing a ticket. It mentions applying for a visa. Those could prime people to think of regular migration. They could be afraid to answer about irregular migration, but they certainly don't. The questions are not directly asked of people in a logical sense that would have any bearing on regular versus irregular.
Thanks a lot. Michelle, you had a question?
Yes, if I may, just a small question about a possible distinction between personal income and household income. So I guess that in the Gallup World Poll survey, you have different measures of income and you have the total income of the household. And if you look at how these incomes are going to impact either desires and plans, I think that there is a different role for household income. Household income doesn't impact the desires, but it impacts the plans and in a positive way. So my hunch is that maybe you make use of that to grab the part of income which is related to self-selection factors and out-selection factors, coming back to the point that I raised before between the discrepancy between desires and plans. I don't know if I'm clear, but it seems to me that there is something that you could exploit in the survey.
Thank you so much. I want you to educate me about this because my prior, and it's an ignorant prior, is that many of these decisions are made at the household level. I mean, people often have their cousins and their friends financing them, to say nothing of their fathers and spouses financing them. So there could never be a binding constraint at the individual level. Or excuse me, there could never be a constraint that is not binding at the individual level that is binding at the household level, or vice versa, simply because they're collective decisions. But you're thinking of a different model, and I want to understand that model. What is that? Why should we expect a different selection on individual versus household income?
Yes, so my idea would be that household income, so basically families could pool resources to finance migration cost of one intended immigrant. And so basically, and it seems that it is the case that basically for a given level of personal income, if you belong to a larger family or with more income at the household level, basically it's going to impact positively the probability that you are going to make some preparation. It's just what I wanted to say about that. And this is quite a different channel from the channel of individual income that you mentioned.
Yes. Now I understand, and I apologize.
Sorry,
but now I understand.
That clear.
No, the constraint is on this side of the ocean, and that's a very interesting thing. All we thought of was getting a proxy for income, and that was the most straightforward one, given that these decisions are financed at the household level, as you say. But actually exploring that distinction could be a whole other paper, and it's a very interesting idea. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, so it's 6:30 p.m. here. I would like to thank Michael and Mariapia for being online with us today. And
thank you.
There were a lot of interesting questions that were handled by Mariapia during your presentation. I will send you a report.
Thank you, Mariapia.
At the end. So thanks a lot, and see you online next week. There's a seminar presentation by Katia Battista and David Mackenzie.
All of you stay safe and healthy. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Mike. Bye.
Thank you.